Right now, while you're watching this, something extraordinary is happening. Your neighbor down the street just bought a new car on finance. The government borrowed another few £1 billion this morning. Your mate from uni is celebrating because he got approved for a bigger mortgage. And somewhere in the city of London, a hedge fund manager is placing a massive bet that all of this is about to come crashing down. Here's what nobody tells you. Every single one of these things is connected, and understanding how they connect is the difference between building real wealth and spending your entire life on a hamster wheel you didn't even know you were running on. I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Picture the economy as a massive ocean. Most people think this ocean is random, unpredictable, like storms that appear out of nowhere. But what if I told you that this ocean moves in patterns, in cycles so precise that once you see them, you can't unsee them? What if everything you've been told about money, about economic crashes, about why your parents struggled or why your grandparents thrived, all comes down to one single force that repeats itself over and over again throughout history? This is exactly what Ray Dalio discovered after studying 500 years of economic history. And what he found will completely change how you think about your money, your debts, and your future. Let me tell you about something that happened in Britain that most people have completely forgotten. In the early 1990s, we had something called Black Wednesday, September 16, 1992. In a single day, the British government spent billions trying to prop up the value of the pound, and it failed spectacularly. George Soros made £1 billion betting against our currency. Interest rates shot up to 15%. Homeowners were devastated. But here's the thing that nobody understood at the time. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was a debt cycle playing out exactly as it had played out dozens of times before throughout history. You see, what Dalio figured out is this: economies don't grow in straight lines. They don't even grow in simple up and down patterns. And they grow in cycles. And the most important cycle, the one that affects everything you own, everything you earn, and everything you'll pass on to your children, is the long-term debt cycle. Think about how you borrow money. Maybe you've got a credit card. When times are good, when you're earning well, you borrow a bit more. You buy things you need, maybe a few things you want. You feel confident you can pay it back. That borrowed money lets you buy more than you could have otherwise. Your life expands. You've got a nicer flat, a better car, perhaps a holiday in Spain. This feels like prosperity, and in many ways it is. Now scale that up to an entire country. Millions of people doing the same thing. Businesses borrowing to expand. The government borrowing to build infrastructure, to fund the NHS, to pay for schools. All of this borrowing creates spending, and spending creates income for someone else, which means they can borrow more, which creates more spending, and round it goes. This is the expansion phase of the debt cycle, and it feels incredible. Jobs everywhere, wages rising, property prices climbing. Everyone feels like a genius. Your mate who bought a house 3 years ago has already made 50 grand on paper. People start saying things like, property always goes up, or you can't lose with bricks and mortar. The confidence builds and builds. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where Ray Dalio's insight becomes absolutely crucial for anyone who wants to protect their wealth. Debt is just a promise to pay money in the future. When you borrow £10,000 today, you're bringing future spending into the present. You get to spend that money now, but you've also committed your future income to paying it back. And this is where the trap closes. As more and more money gets borrowed, as the cycle continues, eventually people and governments reach a point where their incomes can't keep up with their debt payments. The spending slows down. When spending slows down, someone else's income slows down. When their income slows down, they can't borrow as much. The cycle that felt so good on the way up starts to reverse. And this is exactly where we are right now in Britain. In America, across most of the developed world, we're at a point in the long-term debt cycle that only comes around once every 50 to 75 years. The debt levels are higher than they've ever been. Interest rates, after being held artificially low for over a decade, are rising. And the implications for your savings, your pension, your property, everything you've worked for are absolutely massive. What most people don't realize is that we've been here before. Not in our lifetimes, perhaps not even in our parents' lifetimes, but this exact situation has played out repeatedly throughout history. 1873, 1929, 1937, 2008. Each time, the pattern was the same. Debt built up over decades, reached unsustainable levels, and then something broke. Ray Dalio spent years analyzing these moments, looking for the common threads. And what he discovered was both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because once you see the pattern, you realize we're walking down a path that's been walked many times before, and it doesn't always end well. Empowering because if you understand the pattern, you can position yourself to not just survive what's coming, but to actually thrive during it. Let me give you a real example from right here in the UK. Think back to the 2008 financial crisis. Do you remember what happened? Northern Rock failed. People queued outside banks trying to get their money out. Property prices collapsed. Thousands lost their jobs. It felt like the world was ending. But here's what actually happened beneath the surface. The debt cycle had peaked. People had borrowed too much against their homes. Banks had lent money to people who couldn't possibly pay it back. The whole system was built on an assumption that property prices would keep rising forever. When that assumption broke, everything came tumbling down. Now, the government and the Bank of England had a choice. They could let the deleveraging happen naturally, which means let people go bankrupt, let businesses fail, let the pain run its course. Or they could do what Dalio calls printing money and buying assets. They chose the second option. Interest rates dropped to nearly zero. The Bank of England started quantitative easing, essentially creating money out of thin air and using it to buy government bonds. This pumped money into the system, propped up asset prices, and prevented a complete collapse. If you owned assets, property, stocks, businesses, you were saved. Your wealth might have dipped temporarily, but it recovered and then some. But if you were just working for a wage, if you didn't own assets, you got left behind. Your salary barely budged over the next decade while property prices in London doubled, then tripled. The gap between those who owned assets and those who didn't became a chasm. This is the crucial insight that Ray Dalio wants you to understand. In a debt crisis, governments will always choose to print money rather than let the system collapse. They have to. The alternative is too painful politically. But when they print money, that money doesn't spread evenly. It flows primarily to assets. Property, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, anything that's scarce and can hold value. So here's the question you need to ask yourself right now. As we stand at this point in the debt cycle, as inflation is running higher than it has in 40 years, as interest rates are rising, as the cost of servicing government debt is becoming unsustainable, where is your wealth position? Are you holding cash in a savings account earning 2 or 3% while inflation runs at 8 or 9%? If so, you're getting poorer every single day, and you might not even realize it. The number in your account might be going up slightly, but the purchasing power of that money is being destroyed. Are you completely invested in property in one single location, betting everything on the UK housing market continuing to defy gravity? That might have worked for the last 20 years, but debt cycles turn. What worked brilliantly during the expansion phase can be devastating during the contraction phase. Or have you diversified? Have you spread your wealth across different types of assets, different countries, different currencies? Have you positioned yourself for multiple possible outcomes? Ray Dalio has this principle he calls the all-weather portfolio. The idea is simple but profound. You don't know exactly how the future will unfold. You don't know if we'll get deflation like the 1930s or inflation like the 1970s. You don't know if governments will manage to engineer a soft landing or if we'll see a crisis bigger than 2008. What you can do is position yourself so that no matter which way the debt cycle resolves, you've got some part of your portfolio that does well. Some assets that thrive in inflation, some that do well in deflation, some that benefit from growth, some that hold value during contraction. This isn't about getting rich quick. This is about understanding the game that's being played and making sure you're not the one left holding the bag when the music stops. Let me tell you about someone I know. I'll call him David. David's a plumber here in Manchester. Brilliant at his trade, works hard, makes decent money. Back in 2005, he had about £30,000 saved up. His mates were all buying property, stretching themselves to get on the ladder. Everyone told him he was mad not to buy. But David had been reading, learning about debt cycles, about how things work. He felt uncomfortable. Prices seemed too high. People were borrowing 6, 7 times their salary. It felt wrong to him. So he waited. He kept renting, kept saving, and everyone thought he was an idiot. Then 2008 happened. Property prices in his area dropped 30%. His mates who'd stretched to buy were suddenly in negative equity, trapped, some facing repossession. David waited another year until late 2009, then bought a house for 70% of what it would have cost in 2007. He paid cash, no mortgage, no debt. Today, that same house is worth 3 times what he paid. But more importantly, he sleeps soundly. No debt payments, no worry about interest rates. He owns his home outright at 45 years old. David didn't have insider information. He didn't have a finance degree. What he had was an understanding of the debt cycle and the patience to act on that understanding even when everyone around him thought he was wrong. This brings us to the most critical question of all. Where are we in the debt cycle right now, and what should you be doing about it? Ray Dalio has been sounding the alarm for the last few years, and his message is clear. We are in the late stages of a long-term debt cycle. The warning signs are everywhere if you know what to look for. Central banks across the world held interest rates at historic lows for over a decade. They had to because the debt levels were so high that even modest interest rates would crush borrowers. The UK government is now spending more on debt interest than on defense. Think about that for a moment. We're paying more just to service our debts than we spend protecting the entire country. Household debt in Britain is at record levels. The average person is carrying credit card debt, car loans, personal loans, mortgages that are multiples of their income. When interest rates were 1 or 2%, this was manageable barely. Now rates are 5, 6% and climbing. The squeeze is on. But here's what makes this moment different from 2008, and this is crucial. Back then, central banks had room to maneuver. They could drop rates from 5% to 0. They could print money without immediate consequences because inflation was low. They had tools in the toolkit. Today, those tools are either exhausted or they come with devastating side effects. Rates are already being raised to fight inflation. If they cut rates again to stimulate growth, inflation roars back. If they keep rates high to kill inflation, they risk triggering a wave of defaults and a deep recession. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and this is exactly the situation that marks the end of a long-term debt cycle. So what comes next? Dalio has studied this pattern across centuries, and he's identified how these cycles typically resolve. There are four possible paths, and understanding them is essential for protecting yourself. The first path is austerity. The government cuts spending, people pay down debts, everyone tightens their belts. This happened in Greece after their crisis. Unemployment hit 27%. An entire generation was scarred. Wealth was destroyed. This is the most painful path, and it rarely happens voluntarily because it's political suicide. The second path is debt restructuring. This is where debts get written off, banks fail, bondholders lose money. Iceland did this after 2008. They let their banks fail, restructured the debt, took the pain up front. It was brutal for a few years, but they recovered faster than countries that tried to avoid the pain. The third path is wealth redistribution. This is where governments raise taxes on the wealthy, implement wealth taxes, increase inheritance taxes. They take from those who have and give to those who don't to reduce inequality and make the debt burden more manageable. You're seeing hints of this in the UK right now with discussions about capital gains, tax reform, and higher taxes on property. The fourth path, and this is the one Dalio thinks is most likely, is printing money. The government and central bank create new money to inflate away the debt. If you owe £1 million and they double the money supply, your debt is still £1 million, but it's worth half as much in real terms. The debt becomes easier to pay, but everyone's savings and wages lose purchasing power. This is stealth default, and it's happening right now. Look at what's happened over the last 3 years. Massive money printing during COVID. Government spending went through the roof. The money supply expanded faster than at any point since the Second World War. And now we're seeing the consequences. Inflation. Your weekly shop costs 30% more than it did 3 years ago. Your energy bills have doubled or tripled. That's not an accident. That's the debt cycle resolving through inflation. Now here's where this gets personal, where this stops being abstract economic theory and starts being about your financial survival. If the most likely path forward is continued inflation, possibly spiraling into something much worse, what does that mean for how you should position your money right now? Cash becomes toxic. If inflation runs at 8% per year, your cash loses half its value in 9 years. That emergency fund you've carefully built up, sitting in a savings account, is being quietly destroyed, not through some dramatic crash, but through the slow, steady erosion of purchasing power. Fixed income becomes dangerous. Government bonds, corporate bonds, anything that pays you a fixed amount of pounds in the future becomes a terrible investment because those pounds will be worth less when you get them back. The pensioners who bought government bonds thinking they were safe are watching their income buy less and less each month. But assets that are scarce, that can't be printed, that have real value independent of currency, those assets become essential. Property, but not just any property. You need to be selective, look for areas with genuine demand, strong rental yields, properties that will hold value even if the market softens. Equities, particularly companies that can raise prices with inflation, companies with pricing power, real businesses that produce things people actually need. Commodities become interesting again. Gold has been used as a store of value for 5,000 years for a reason. When currencies are being debased, when governments are printing money, gold tends to hold its purchasing power. It's not about gold going up. It's about paper money going down and gold staying the same. And here's something Ray Dalio has been emphasizing recently. You need to think about geographic diversification. Don't have all your wealth in pounds, in UK assets, tied to the fate of one government's fiscal decisions. The debt cycle is playing out globally, but different countries are at different stages, handling it in different ways. Singapore is running budget surpluses. Switzerland has a completely different monetary policy. Some emerging markets have young populations and low debt levels. Spreading your wealth across different jurisdictions, different currencies, different economic systems, this isn't being unpatriotic. This is being smart. Think about it like this. If you were on a ship and you noticed it was taking on water, would you stay in your cabin hoping for the best, or would you quietly make your way to the lifeboats? Understanding the debt cycle is about seeing the water before the ship starts listing. I want to share something with you that changed my entire perspective on money, and it comes directly from Ray Dalio's understanding of how the world actually works. He says that the biggest mistake people make is assuming that what worked for the last 10 years will work for the next 10 years. But debt cycles change everything. The rules that made people wealthy in one phase of the cycle can destroy them in the next phase. Your parents or grandparents might have told you to save your money in a building society, work for the same company for 40 years, rely on your pension. That advice made perfect sense in the 1960s and 70s when interest rates were high, when companies offered final salary pensions, when the debt cycle was in a completely different phase. But following that same advice today, in this phase of the cycle, is financial suicide. Let me give you a stark example. In 1980, if you put £10,000 in a savings account at 15% interest, you were doubling your money every 5 years just by doing nothing. Being conservative with cash was smart. Fast forward to today. That same £10,000 in a savings account at 3% interest while inflation runs at 8% means you're losing 5% of your purchasing power every single year. Being conservative with cash is now the riskiest thing you can do. This is what Dalio means when he talks about paradigm shifts. The entire game has changed, but most people haven't noticed. They're still playing by the old rules, wondering why they're falling further and further behind. So let me get practical with you. What should you actually do right now, today, to position yourself for what's coming? First, you need to get brutally honest about your debt situation. Not all debt is created equal. If you've got credit card debt at 19% interest, that's an emergency. That needs to be paid off immediately, even if it means selling things, taking on extra work, whatever it takes. High-interest consumer debt in a rising rate environment is like having a financial anchor tied around your neck. But mortgage debt, that's different. If you locked in a fixed-rate mortgage at 2% for 5 years back in 2021, you've got cheap money. Don't rush to pay that off. That debt is being inflated away. Instead, take any extra money and invest it in assets that will appreciate faster than your mortgage rate. Second, you need to build what Dalio calls an all-weather approach to your savings. Take whatever you've got set aside, whether it's £5,000 or $500,000, and think about splitting it into buckets. One bucket for safety and liquidity. Yes, you need some cash for emergencies, for opportunities, for peace of mind. Maybe 3 to 6 months of expenses. But that's it. No more. Another bucket for growth assets. Stocks, index funds, investment trusts. Companies that make real products, generate real profits, have real pricing power. not speculative tech stocks that might be worth nothing in 5 years, but solid businesses that will still be operating in 20 years regardless of what happens to the economy. A third bucket for inflation hedges. This could be property, could be commodities, could be gold, could be inflation-linked bonds. Assets that tend to do well when the purchasing power of money is falling. And a fourth bucket, this is the one most people ignore, for asymmetric opportunities. Small positions in things that could explode in value if the debt cycle resolves in certain ways. Maybe that's Bitcoin, maybe it's emerging market stocks. Maybe it's a small business investment. Things where you can afford to lose your entire investment, but if you're right, it could change your financial life. Third, and this is perhaps most important, you need to invest in yourself. Your skills, your knowledge, your ability to generate income regardless of what's happening in the economy. The debt cycle is going to create massive disruption over the next decade. Entire industries will be restructured. Some jobs will disappear, but disruption creates opportunity for those who are prepared. Ray Dalio talks about how the best investment you can make is in your own earning power. Learn skills that are valuable across different economic environments. If you're a software developer, you'll find work whether the economy is booming or struggling. If you're a skilled tradesperson, plumber, electrician, carpenter, there will always be demand. If you understand sales, marketing, how to create value for other people, you're never going to be stuck. The people who get destroyed in debt cycle transitions are those who have one source of income, no assets, no skills that translate to the new economy, and massive debts. Don't be that person. Build multiple income streams. Freelance on the side. Start a small business. Invest in rental property. Create something that generates money while you sleep. Fourth, and I cannot stress this enough, you need to stay liquid and flexible. The next few years are going to present opportunities that we can't even imagine right now. When the debt cycle turns, when things break, assets get repriced. Property that was overvalued becomes affordable. Businesses that were over-leveraged go on sale, but you can only take advantage of these opportunities if you've got capital available and you're not locked into rigid positions. I've seen this happen personally. In 2009, I watched people with cash buy investment properties for 40 pence on the pound. Properties that landlords were desperate to sell, that banks had repossessed, that nobody wanted because everyone was terrified. Those same properties are now worth 3 times what they paid. But the only people who could take advantage were those who had cash available and the courage to act when everyone else was paralyzed by fear. Fifth, you need to think generationally. This isn't just about you. It's about your children, your grandchildren. The decisions you make now about how to position your wealth will echo through your family for decades. Dalio talks about how wealthy families stay wealthy across generations. It's not because they're smarter or work harder. It's because they understand these cycles. They position themselves to benefit when the cycle turns. They buy assets when everyone else is selling in panic. They take chips off the table when everyone else is euphoric and over-leveraged. You can do this too. You don't need to be a Rothschild or a Rockefeller. You just need to understand the game being played and position yourself accordingly. Here's the bottom line, and this is what Ray Dalio has been trying to tell anyone who will listen. We are living through a once-in-a-lifetime transition in the debt cycle. What happens over the next 5 to 10 years will determine whether you build lasting wealth or spend the rest of your life struggling. The opportunity is there, but so is the danger. The wealthy already know this. They're repositioning. They're moving money out of cash and into assets. They're diversifying across countries and currencies. They're preparing for multiple scenarios. The question is, are you? You have a choice right now. You can ignore what's happening, hope for the best, keep doing what you've always done. Or you can open your eyes, see the pattern, and position yourself to not just survive, but thrive in what's coming. The debt cycle is breaking. That's not a prediction. It's a mathematical certainty. The only question is whether you'll be ready when it does,